time while I'm talking, you want to walk away, feel free. That will not bother me in the least. We are acutely aware of how limited your time is in our little island. However, in the interest of full disclosure, you should know that I am the finest looking male ranger in the National Park Service. So if you're going to walk away, you're going to want to get a happy snap of me so you can print me out and stick me on your refrigerator when you go back home. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the most commonly asked questions and kind of weave them into a little historical narrative, last about 5 or 6 minutes long. And then after that, I'll give you a couple of things to think about, and then I'll shut up, and both James and I are here to answer your questions. I would recommend to you that you spend about a third of your time on this level, and this level goes all the way around. There's a set of stairs that takes you up to the top level. A third of your time on the top level, we call it the observation deck, and then a third of your time in that museum right there. And use 40 minutes because that'll give you plenty of time to go whichever. If you visited the store back at Liberty Square where you came from, this is the same store, same merchandise, same employees, same prices. So if you've already been there, you're welcome to go into this one, but you've already been there. All right, so why Fort Sumter? Excuse me, ma'am, could you hop off the bricks, please? Those are handmade by slaves 150 years ago, and they are irreplaceable. So Fort Sumter is a direct result of the War of 1812. Who were we fighting in that war? The British. Some people call it the Second Revolutionary War. And during the first year of that war, the U.S. Navy sailed up under the Great Lakes and burned part of Toronto, Canada. During the second year of that war, the Royal Navy reciprocated, sailed up the Chesapeake Bay to Washington, D.C., burned the Capitol and the White House. So our nation's leadership said, enough of that. We built about 4 dozen coastal defense forts along the United States to protect coastal cities. They start in Maine, go all the way down the East Coast, including this one, all the way to the tip of Florida, all the way across the Gulf. And the one that's farthest from us here is called Fort Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. You've probably heard of that one. Where do you put a fort? You put a fort somewhere based on the range of the weapons that you're going to use from that fort. So at the time these forts were being built in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s before the Civil War, the most common cannon was the one that you passed as you walked in the front gate there. It's called a 42-pounder because it fires a 42-pound cannonball about 1.5 miles. Already existing at the mouth of Charleston Harbor were 2 forts. Fort Johnson over this way was built by the Brits just after 1700, and Fort Moultrie on the other side of the main ship channel this way was built by American revolutionaries in 1776. Those 2 forts from each other are about 3 miles. When you have 1.5 mile guns that are 3 miles apart, there's some dead space. So that dead space defined for the engineers where they needed to build Fort Sumter. So they came out, surveyed, found the shallowest water, and this is where the man-made island was constructed. I should add that all of that sandy area that James asked you to stay off of, those thousands of acres of marsh grass and hundreds of trees, that's all new. That was not there until after World War II. So before that, we had 1 mile of open water completely surrounding this fort. Fort's under construction for over 30 years. Now it's November of 1860. A guy named Lincoln gets elected to the presidency. One of his campaign promises is no more states joining from the unincorporated Western territories that can be authorized to come into the United States where slavery is allowed. That was enough of a threat to the plantation-based economy to the Deep South that South Carolina, which was the most densely populated slave state, 57% of the humans in South Carolina were property at the time of Lincoln's election. So 6 weeks after Lincoln was elected, South Carolina says, we quit. We're no longer part of the United States. A week after that, the U.S. Army moved its headquarters from Fort Moultrie, 1 mile away on Sullivan's Island, out here to Fort Sumter. All the forts in the area were falling down. Fort Moultrie was in the best shape, but of Fort Moultrie, one of the soldiers said, if we improve the walls a little bit, perhaps the cows will stop climbing over them and grazing on our parade ground. So if you can't keep enemy cattle out, you're going to have a hard time keeping anybody more determined out. This fort, on the other hand, I already talked about 1 mile of open water all the way around, and for those of you who can see it, we've painted a red stripe on the flagpole up there. That's the original height of the walls. This is a 5-sided fort, and that's how high the 5 walls went to at that particular time. The U.S. Army moved out here with 85 troops and enough food to last until the middle of April. In February, 6 more states joined South Carolina, and it became the Confederate States of America. In March, Lincoln was inaugurated because that's when we did it back then. After Lincoln had been in office a few weeks, kind of got his feet underneath him, he said, you know what, we're sending food escorted by warships of the U.S. Navy down to Fort Sumter. As soon as the Confederate States heard that, they gave an ultimatum to the U.S. Army soldiers here, and the commander here, a guy by the name of Robert Anderson, said, gentlemen, you have your orders, I have mine. If we are not fated to meet again in this life, may the Lord grant that we meet again in the next. Shooting started a couple hours thereafter, and after a day and a half, nobody had been killed on either side, but this fort was on fire. Hot shot, in this case a 42-pound cannonball that was heated up cherry red in a fire, lodged in one of the barracks buildings, caught that thing on fire. It was April 13th, middle of April. They were out of food, had been eating salt pork out of barrels for weeks. A Confederate delegation came out and said, okay, now are you ready to evacuate the fort? And Major Anderson said, yep, I'll evacuate. So the U.S. Army moved out of here. The Confederate States Army moved in here. They held the fort for the next 4 years, 46 months to be precise. And in February of 1865, the Confederacy abandoned Charleston militarily and pulled all their troops out of Charleston. And the U.S. Army and Navy came right back in. During the previous 18 months, from the summer of 1863 until that date in February of 1865, the U.S. Army had taken a little island over here called Morris Island. It's about 9/10 of a mile away. You'll be able to see it from the observation level. And they started shelling all the forts in Charleston, including this one. And so over the 18 months of U.S. Army shelling, this fort was hit by over 32,000 projectiles weighing at least 100 pounds. And that's what took the top 30 feet off the walls. In fact, you can see one right behind me there. It's at 9 o'clock. If 12 o'clock is straight up, 6 o'clock is straight down. On the left-hand side, you see the back of a projectile right there. That's one of the 32,000 that came sailing in from Morris Island and landed over there. There's two more over here. There's a little sign that kind of points them out. After the Civil War, this was an Army fort. It was built up and then fell into disuse and disrepair, built up, fell into disuse and disrepair. Until the late 1890s, the Army came back and did a technology upgrade, built this big black thing. Instead of 135 guns that fired a 42-pound cannonball a mile and a half, there were just 2 guns on this big black thing that each fired a 1,000-pound projectile 8 miles. After they rigged the guns, they coated that battery with black tar to waterproof it so the powder stored down below would stay dry. And then they filled in what I call the front yard with sand. So you're standing on the parade ground, and that originally went to all 5 walls. Once this battery was put in place just across the middle of the fort, the front side has 18 feet of sand in it. And the reason for that is if a modern warship attacked the fort and fired at it, those modern guns would very easily pierce the 5-foot thick brick walls. But what they're not going to do is pierce those brick walls and then run through 150 feet of sand. So when you walk up to the top, you're going to be walking up and staying up because that sand is still there. All this, the Park Service excavated in the 1950s. Let me give you something to think about. You know, when you got off that ferry boat and you looked up there, you saw that flag. Objectively, every single person here said, oh, that's the flag of the United States of America. No argument. But subjectively, each one of us looked at that piece of cloth just a little bit differently. Some of us are from foreign nations, and we look at that flag through the lens of our own experience and learning. Some of us were born in foreign nations, but we've chose to make the United States our permanent home. Yet a different subjective perspective. Many of us are native-born United States citizens. Probably more than a few have a uniform hanging in the back of the closet with that flag sewn on the arm as a reminder of services rendered to our republic. Different subjective perspectives still. What I'd like to challenge you to do is pull your feet out of your shoes for a couple of minutes and slide them into somebody else's. Try and perceive the world the way that somebody else might. Let's start with that wealthy plantation and slave owner. It's 2 days after Christmas in the year 1860. Abraham Lincoln has been elected but not yet inaugurated, and you've been part of the independent Republic of South Carolina for a whole week. You're standing on the veranda of your high-end townhome looking out at this enormous Lord of the Rings looking fort. Walls going up to the red stripe, open water all the way around it, and it's been part of the Charleston Harbor viewscape for over 3 decades. And you're wondering how this whole secession thing is going to change your spot at the tippy top of the social and economic pyramid. And while you're thinking about that, because it's a cool December day, you're quite happy when a cup of hot coffee comes out to you, carried out by your house slave. Let's slide our feet into the shoes of that enslaved servant, if he or she even had shoes. You know that something's going on because you've heard your master talking about it, and you'd love to grab the paper and check out the details, but you can't read. Because you see, it's a crime to teach enslaved people to read or write. Because when you've got somebody underneath the boot heel of oppression, the last thing you want to do is give them the means with which to exchange ideas, especially ideas that are seditious and might upset the order of things. You just remember your mom and dad coming home late from the plantation brickyard where they helped make the millions of bricks that it took to finish this fort. And stories about your grandfather working with the other enslaved laborers out on Charleston Harbor, throwing more than 100,000 tons of rock over the side to help create this man-made island upon which a fort was going to be constructed to guarantee security and freedom to everybody in Charleston, except for you. Or slide your feet into those one-size-fits-all boots of the Civil War soldier. Doesn't matter what side. You're dressed in wool from head to toe, which wouldn't be too bad on a cool autumn day like today, but come back in the summertime. You're trying to find out what's going on too, but clearly nobody paid the cable bill because you can't get headline news. And you keep trying to call your mom to let her know that not only might you be late for supper, you might be late forever, but you can't get a signal. If you could do that, appreciate different perspectives, then I would tell you you're on the road to understanding one of the things that makes the United States really special, and that's diversity. And what diversity is not so much about is where you're born or what language you speak or what color your skin is or what you choose to worship, but it's about understanding that we each have different perspectives on things. And though those perspectives may differ, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is any better or worse than any other. They just may be different. And one of the things that we might have to agree to do is disagree. But we can do that courteously. We can do that with respect for one another. Then we can walk down to the corner, buy ourselves a tall, frosty, carbonated adult beverage and talk about something that's really important, like what's the next national park we're going to go visit. So thanks for coming out here. Thanks for listening. Enjoy your visit.